In 2023, I organized a breakout conversation at the SBC Annual Meeting focused on adult sexual abuse and how churches can respond wisely, compassionately, and biblically to survivors. Part of that conversation involved addressing some misunderstandings that can arise in Christian communities about abuse, responsibility, and how Scripture speaks to those situations. I brought together a small panel for discussion, including Dr. Heather Evans, a clinical social worker who specializes in trauma and abuse recovery, and abuse survivor Chellee Taylor. At the end of the session, Chellee and her husband Peter also joined me for a conversation about what it looks like for churches to care well for survivors. Chellee now serves on the board of Hope's Companion. Conversations like this were part of the early work that eventually led to the formation of this ministry. I'm sharing this recording because these issues remain important, and many church leaders are still trying to understand how to respond in ways that bring healing rather than deepen shame. I hope you find the conversation helpful.
Good evening. I want to welcome all of you here tonight as we discuss an important topic related to our efforts to bring about sexual abuse reform in our convention. So tonight, our focus is understanding adult abuse. Even as we've seen progress in addressing sexual abuse in our denomination, many of us as pastors, as leaders, as lay people remain uncertain about abuse when the victim is an older teen or an adult. And so, meanwhile, several of our high-profile abuse cases in the guidepost report and in the media in recent days involve adult victims of abuse, including the two major lawsuits that have been filed against the SBC by men credibly accused of adult abuse. One of the rationales for choosing our theme this year is to bring clarity to that issue and a fuller understanding of adult abuse. And this understanding is crucial in care and protection of others. I hope that you leave here tonight with an understanding of not only how abuse occurs, but to correctly identify abuse when it does occur and respond in a way that loves and cares well for survivors. Our speakers tonight include Dr. Heather Evans. She is a licensed clinical social worker and a counselor, a subject matter expert on the issue of complex trauma and abuse. And so we're happy to have her here. She has served with the previous sex abuse task force and is currently a consultant on the AIRTF, given the current task force bringing about abuse reforms in the SBC. Chellee Taylor is here, and she is a survivor of adult clergy sexual abuse and is using her story to help educate others, help educate churches, help educate us in this room on how to care well for survivors of abuse. We'll also hear from her husband, Peter, as they share some of their story with us. My name is Todd Benkert. I pastor Oak Creek Community Church in Mishawaka, Indiana, and I am one of the editors for SBC Voices, who is the sponsor for this event. So I'm thankful for your presence here tonight as we continue to grow in our understanding of abuse, as we equip ourselves to make a difference with the respective spheres of influence that God has given us. And so I'm thankful that you're here. I also want to thank, we have several clergy abuse survivors in the room, and I want to thank you for your presence, honoring us, not only being at this meeting, but being in this room tonight. So thank you. So we're going to begin with our subject matter expert. I'm going to ask Dr. Heather Evans to come and share about the dynamics of adult abuse.
Thank you. I just want to thank you all for being here. It's been a long day, an intense day, and you have made it a point to end your day by being committed to come here, and I thank you for that. And I hope that your hearts and eyes and ears are just willing to be open and to learn together tonight. There are two places in Scripture where God's house is is told that it has turned into a sanctuary for robbers. The first one is Jeremiah 7. He's quoting God, and he is calling them out for worshiping a large idol that was full of fire and in which children were sacrificed. And the second place is when Jesus turned over the tables in order to cleanse the temple and said, "Why are you making this house meaning sanctuary, refuge, into a den for robbers? Robbers, those who take." Diane Langberg, in her book, In Our Lives First, says that the measures of our faithfulness to God are, number one, the way we conduct ourselves in our relationship to our fellow humans, and two, in the stamping out of sins that wrong humanity. She says only when these conditions are met do we as his people flesh out the character of a holy and loving God to the afflicted and needy. Once again, thank you for being here. It's very important to listen, to bear witness as we consider making the church a safe place, because it takes all of us to make the church a safe place. And bearing witness is costly, and you've come and you've chosen to enter in. So this topic of adult sexual abuse, maybe you're asking, well, how big of a deal is this? How often does it actually happen? Well, I think if you listen tonight, you'll hear why we actually don't really have accurate statistics, because so many are not reported. They're afraid to report. They have been convinced otherwise, that it wasn't really abuse. But I want to just quote a couple of surveys that are out there. Number one is a very recent survey by Sheila Gregoire, Rebecca Lindenbach, and Joanna Sawatsky. Maybe you've seen their newest book, She Deserves Better, Raising Girls to Resist Toxic Teachings on Sex, Self, and Speaking Up. So it was a survey of 7,500 women of their experiences as teenagers. Now, as teenagers, 18.7% of the respondents of 7,500, 18.7% reported being sexually harassed at church before they turned 18. Of those who were harassed as minors, 10.2% received unwanted attention from their pastor. 20.3% were harassed by a youth leader or Sunday school teacher, and 47.4% were harassed by another adult in the church. So that's before the age of 18. Now, in 2008, there was a general social survey, and they wanted to specifically focus on this idea of clergy-perpetrated sexual abuse, adult sexual abuse. And for them, they found that 3% of the women that they surveyed, that this had happened to them, that at some time they had had an unwanted sexual advance from a church leader at some point during their adulthood. That would be the equivalent of 7 women in an average size congregation of 400. Those are just some examples to show you it does happen, but it's, again, really hard for us to have accurate statistics. I heard that David Fuller is in the room. I'm so excited because I just really came across your research, and he is doing amazing work, and you should look at their website for Baylor University. Great stuff on how churches can become educated. But I'm going to be referring to his work, his research that they've done out of Baylor in 2015, because it is the first national survey of adult survivors of clergy-perpetrated sexual abuse. There were 280 survivors that participated in the study. So here, just to get an idea, 280 participants that represented 42 states. The average length of abuse of those individuals was 4 years, and the average age the abuse started was 30%. 65% of those survivors were married, and the perpetrator, the average age was 45, and only 4% of the perpetrators were prosecuted. Only 4% of the perpetrators were prosecuted. A survey of 280 women who experienced abuse as an adult. So how do we define adult sexual abuse, and how do we understand what actually makes it abuse? So first, let's take that word sexual abuse. Sexual of or pertaining to sex, and abuse, to use wrongly for one's intended purposes. So it's any sexual activity, verbal, visual, or physical, engaged in without consent, where sex was used wrongly for one's intended purposes. Again, it can be verbal in nature, such as sexual threats, sexual comments about someone's body, lewd remarks, harassment, sexually suggestive comments that were unwanted. Visual, such as forcing someone to view pornographic material, exhibitionism, or voyeurism. And physical sexual abuse, which it does not just include intercourse. It includes sodomy, oral sex, digital penetration, penetration with an object, just to name a few. All abuse includes a misuse of power. So we can't talk about abuse without talking about power. For a minor, simply by their age, there's an acknowledgement of the lack of consent. But for sexual abuse of an adult, it's still an issue of consent and power. Now, by the way, for the rest of the presentation, I will be using female pronouns because the majority of adult sexual abuse victims are female, but that does not mean that there are not male victims. So that's just for ease of the presentation. How do we differentiate between consensual and non-consensual sexual activities in adulthood? Well, we have to first consider, did I want, choose, and agree to this? Has someone else used their power to force or coerce sexual activity? So an example would be someone who goes on a date and a female states her boundary that she doesn't want to have sex, or perhaps that she's waiting till she's married to have sex, but he's saying no when he starts to make sexual advantages, but he pushes further until he takes what he wants. Eventually she concedes, which is a brain and body's response of protecting itself, particularly with somebody who's physically stronger than her. She did not choose it or agree to it. In fact, she verbalized the opposite, but it was ignored and overruled. We must, as I said, also consider dynamics of power. If you have not read Diane Nyberg's book, Redeeming Power, I highly recommend it. She breaks down and there are the types of power. So some examples of types of power are verbal, positional, economic, spiritual, intellectual, emotional. Keep those things in mind as we talk. In any dynamic where a person has power, there is capacity for that power to be abused. When there is a power differential, it sets up a circumstance that hinders someone from saying no. So let's take the example of a husband in a Christian marriage who doesn't take no for an answer and expects regular sex from his wife. And where a wife has been taught that it's sinful to deprive her husband. She may believe that if they don't have sexual relationships once every few days, it's going to cause him to lust or act out in sexual sin, or that she's responsible for any irritable mood that he has. Keep in mind, by nature of most men, just by physique and size and stature, they have physical power over their wives. There's emotional power by the nature of the relationship, and there's spiritual and positional power. If she holds to the common belief that her husband is the head of the household, she may believe that this means that she has no choice but to obey him and what he says, because to verbalize something different is to go against God himself. Now think about a church leader. Remember those types of power I mentioned? What kind of power do they hold? Positional, spiritual, emotional. So clergy sexual abuse happens when a person with religious authority uses their role, position, and power to sexually harass, exploit, or engage in sexual activity with a person in their care. This can include, but is not limited to, sexualizing conversations, including telephone, social media, or email, asking for or transmitting unwanted sexual images or texts, touching or hugging someone, or like prolonged hugging that wasn't asked for, pushing for sexual involvement, creating hostility when the person being targeted attempts to set boundaries, using sexual language and jokes, invading personal space. How does this happen? And how do we know it's not a consensual affair? If it's non-consensual, why can't the victim just run away or fight back? Well, again, clergy sexual abuse is about the misuse of power by the perpetrator to exploit and control, and the inability of the victim to provide consent because of that power differential. Even if an individual concedes to some sort of sexual interaction, contact, or relationship, That agreement does not constitute consent if the person believed they didn't have permission or the freedom to say no. So the same dynamics and tactics that you may be familiar of how a perpetrator might abuse someone who is a minor are used with people who are adults as well. Anna Salter, who wrote an amazing book called Predators, Pedophiles, and Other Rapists, says that misplaced trust is the predator's most powerful resource. Misplaced trust. Relationship and trust, sadly, are the greatest tools for an abuser. They slowly build their character and reputation while gradually breaking down barriers, sometimes so slow that the victim may feel confused and second guess their own questions or concerns about the behavior. This is called grooming. And grooming is common because a church leader has too much to lose to not groom. Just as a wolf finds a way to lure and attack a sheep, so an abuser intentionally lures his or her victim until attack. Grooming is a process that slowly dulls the instincts and defenses of the victim and surrounding community, builds an impenetrable trust and sense of safety and protection, so that if the truth came forward, both the victim and the surrounding community would doubt their own judgment, question the truth at all costs, and protect the pitiable, trusted, quote unquote, nice leader over the victim. Grooming occurs for the community as well. So a woman, let's say she seeks out help, or the pastoral leader is the one to initiate contact. It might start as formal counseling, but the relationship could also be framed as discipleship or spiritual advice or even a caring friendship. The path to explicit sexual activity is frequently months and often a year in the making. In fact, Puller's study talks about an average length of time. It was 4 years. So it's not, these relationships are not just this one-time mistake or occurrence. The grooming happens over a period of time, and the relationship and the abuse happens over a period of time. A perpetrator often uses the religious context and his power, authority, and their shared spiritual life and language to manipulate and groom the targeted person. Bible verses, spiritual admonitions, sexual touch, talk, frequent hugs, prolonged hugs, and invitations to be together are used to slowly convince a woman that she's important, their relationship is special and unique, and that sexual activity is acceptable. Or in some cases, they're told even sanctioned by God in the relationship. Puller talks about how survivors often report that sexual talk and flirtation are extremely confusing and are experienced as betrayal of a sacred relationship. These are often as damaging as explicit sexual activity, the betrayal aspect, because of that spiritual relationship. So when the targeted woman voices her concern about the sexual activity, the perpetrator often responds with, "If this becomes known and people leave the faith, it will be your fault." Those kinds of statements happen quite often. The blame, the responsibility is put on the woman. By this point, she often feels loyal to her abuser because he's convinced her that she would ruin the ministry and vicariously would ruin God's ministry if she said something. The perpetrator maintains sexual access and is able to keep her silent through the use of shame. This abuse cycle is as much about power and control as it is about sexual gratification. Unfortunately, making it known can end up further traumatizing the person who speaks up. So there's fear, shame, and the experience of confusion. There's an uncertainty about what's really going on, what's really happening. This disbelief, like, could this actually really be happening? And the fear of being wrong and being socially embarrassed. All of this interferes with the victim speaking up. The possibility that the pastor would harm them was incongruent with this deep sense that congregations and their leaders could be trusted. Therefore, those who had experienced abuse, they remained confused, paralyzed, and unable to make sense of their behavior that was not congruent with the other supportive behavior they'd encountered. Something that was really important in Puller's study that I want to mention is this. 67% of the respondents of his study had unresolved trauma prior to being abused. Hold on to that for a second. And similarly, 61% reported being counseled by the leader when the abuse started. Unresolved trauma is important because it's one of the vulnerabilities that these perpetrators exploited. And then that second thing of the counseling relationship is important because it highlights that counseling was the doorway that the perpetrator used to gain access to over half the respondents. Now, I don't want you to mishear me on this. I think this is just very important and very angering and sobering. The key word here is vulnerability. Vulnerability is not a problem. That's an aspect of our humanity, and it applies to legitimate human need and desires. But someone who abuses power takes legitimate human need and exploits them for their own gain. If someone has previous abuse or trauma, for example, they already have beliefs that have been formed from how they interpreted these previous events, especially of what happened in childhood. They may have learned my body is not my own, or I don't have any say to what happens with my body. They may have learned that they don't have a voice. They may have learned how to yield power out of survival. They may even have a trauma response of fight, flight, freeze, or appease that involuntarily, reflexively happens with abuse of power by their church leader. They've already previously learned from their environment lies about themselves, God, their voice, their power. So they're less apt to speak up and push back. And do not misunderstand me. I am not saying, oh, well, this is why this happened because she had a previous history. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying these are the people who should be experiencing safe support in the church and not be preyed upon, not have their vulnerability exploited, should be protected to the point of healing, not exploited for further damage. So regardless of any previous trauma, you have a man of spiritual power who has slowly groomed you, shown attention and affection, and often threatens you to remain silent. And the majority of the cases, you're meeting with him for counseling, and there's a lack of accountability that makes it easy for that dynamic to be misused. So why don't they just run away? Why don't they fight back? I hope you're already hearing the confusion. And there's many reasons, many dynamics why it's not that easy. All these things have been set up physically, psychologically, mentally, and spiritually that you can't just leave. Judith Herman, who is a pioneer in trauma, she says about trafficking survivors, so human trafficking survivors, she says that kind of trauma is so complex because of the captivity. Well, I'm here to tell you as somebody who's worked with trafficking survivors for over 10 years. I see the same type of captivity with clergy sex abuse survivors because the captivity is just so intense, the connection, the mental, emotional, relational, and spiritual connection. It's not physical captivity. I'm not saying the pastor holds them physically captive. It's the mental, emotional, spiritual captivity. In a Safe to Hope podcast, and I encourage you to listen, there's a whole segment where a survivor shares her story, and then there's other experts. I think Dave Puller, you're one of them. The survivor says this: leaving him felt like a matter of survival. Leaving him would be leaving God's authority. If she left him, she would be leaving God's authority. So in addition to that, I've referenced a little bit our body's response to trauma. We have this built-in stress response system. We have an alarm called the amygdala that's meant to go off when there's threat or danger. And when it goes off, we go into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Fawn, another word for fawn is like appease. Many times survivors can't and don't run away because it's their body and brain's way of protecting itself. That word fawn is like your body's way of conceding, trying to appease someone to avoid conflict. It's an involuntary, reflexive response. May I say that again? It's a reflexive response, how the body responds to cope with and fight the danger and the threat. And it may take years for survivors to come to understand this and have compassion for themselves and how their brain and body naturally reacted. So what are some of the ideas that we have that actually hinder us as the body of Christ from being helpful? What are some of the things that we've come to actually believe? I'm actually going to read a little bit of a lengthy quote, but it's so good. Judith Herman, this trauma pioneer I mentioned, she just came out with a new book called Truth and Repair: How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice. And she goes back and interviews these survivors she's worked with over decades and is asking them, what does justice mean to you? What do you really want for justice? So powerful, but listen to this. Now, she's talking about tyrants and tyranny in the idea of cruelty and oppression, okay? So anytime I use the word tyranny or tyrant, just think about abuse and oppression. She says this, and this is my exhortation and challenge for all of us in the room. What about all those who collaborate? The enablers, the apologists, those who profit from the subjection of others? What about all those who collude implicitly? The people who prefer not to know the truth or choose not to help? The people who say, it's none of my business, and those who are just looking out for themselves? What about those who blame themselves for disturbing the peace? What about those who are tasked with implementing justice, but instead ally themselves with the powerful? Often survivors will feel the bitterness of these betrayals more deeply, even than the direct harms inflicted by the perpetrators. No tyrant is omnipotent, no matter how grandiose his claims. The regime of tyranny cannot be maintained without the active complicity or passive acquiescence of many other people. Once bystanders begin to take a righteous stand in support of survivors, the power of the tyrant begins to crumble. For this reason, repairing the harms of tyranny, first of all, requires bystanders and the larger community to recognize their own moral responsibility and to take action in solidarity with those who have been harmed. They must find the courage to seek out and acknowledge the truth, to overcome their fear of cynicism, to denounce the crimes of tyranny, and to ally with survivors in the name of human dignity. It is this reconciliation with the larger community that many survivors seek when they speak of justice. I thank you all for coming tonight because you're showing that I want to listen and I want to be an ally. And I encourage that because I'm pausing, I'm going off script of what I wanted to share because this whole sex abuse reform thing in the SBC is a collective commitment. It means everybody is participating, because if you don't participate, you're complicit. And that's what survivors are looking for in terms of justice, those around them and how they respond. Diane Langberg talks about the culture of systems, and she says that systems consist of things or people so closely connected to make an organic whole. A system has power significantly greater than any one of its parts. All of that power is brought to bear when the system is threatened. That is a good and often life-saving response when a system is threatened by disease or injury. It's life-endangering when all the forces used to hide something wrong or poisonous to the system. For example, pain in the body. So, if we give immediate attention, like something's wrong, right? Like we have to respond because something's wrong. So all of our body system unites to figure out what's wrong and to take care of it and protect that injured part in a healing way. But what if we decide to ignore pain? If I ignored pain, you might even call me foolish and say, well, that's stupid. That's going to cost you a lot. Like you're just going to just keep going and ignore that pain. But this happens, she says, in systems that bear the name of Christ. Where is our energy going? To maintain a good appearance and ignore the disease? She says the church is called by God to tend his lambs. We're not called to protect our institutions, nor do we protect the name of God, the God of truth, by covering up sin and or crime. To do so is to protect the cancer, and cancer kills. We honor God by caring for the wounded and by driving sin to the light and calling it by its right name. But why? Well, Krista Brown in her book, This Little Light, says people are blinded by what they want to believe when ugly news involves people they trust and religious institutions they love. Of the survivors that David Puller's research interviewed, 33% agree or strongly agree that they were believed when they reported the abuse. Only 33% felt that they were believed. 9% thought that the church was helpful when they reported the abuse, and actually almost half agreed or strongly agreed that how the church responded was actually worse than the abuse itself. And 15%, only 15%, said that their church or denomination thoroughly investigated the report. Those are staggering sobering statistics. How does this happen? You know what? Unfortunately, like the beliefs that we have, the misconceptions we have, so often this abuse is called an affair. The thing is, and really fail to understand the misuse of power and all the stuff that we've just been talking about. But the thing is about that whole affair thing, what ends up happening is this word called DARVO, first coined by Jennifer Fried in the 1990s. DARVO stands for Defend, Attack, Reverse, Victim, Offender, meaning the bend seems to be assumed a woman, it was the temptress, and must have done something that caused this man of God to fall. There's an overemphasis on protecting the church leader and the system at all costs, to the extent of blaming the reports and someone trying to tear down the ministry or distract from the advancement of the Bible. And perhaps it's also this disbelief that my trusted, loved church leader was so capable of sin or evil. Remember, the pastor's already been grooming not just the victims, but the surrounding environment and community, that he's a nice guy, spiritual, trusted, and incapable of something horrific. Pastors, maybe they'll admit to an inappropriate relationship or a one-time mistake when they're caught, but they rarely admit to abusive power dynamics. There just tends to be more sympathy for the pastor and shame and blame for the woman. And there's often protection of a person in power or a system over the most vulnerable. A couple of other things that are concerning. In Garland and Argueda's study on clergy sexual misconduct, they talk about a culture of niceness. And the thing that bothers me about this culture of niceness is they talk about this idea that women sometimes, they don't want to embarrass or hurt the pastor, so they don't say anything. Women have this pressure to be nice, but then abusers use niceness as their greatest tool and as the reason, their reputation is why it couldn't be possible. Meanwhile, victims are afraid that I won't be believed. If I don't do the nice thing, the nice, sweet thing. There was another comment by a study, Scarcella and Crabiel, and they talk about harmful theology. Our ideas of forgiveness, sin, atonement, and how our theology sometimes sets things up to create a vulnerability in congregants. Maybe congregants who've been taught, you don't make waves. You don't speak out about things. You don't question things or confront them. That's you being divisive, or that's you being gossipy. And there's one more thing that's concerning. There's kind of this idea that the male is the protector of the marriage, the protector of the household. If women are told they need to be protected by men, it leaves them vulnerable to men who abuse power. This idea can get really twisted, that men are superior to women in every way, especially power and authority, and that women are incompetent and not trustworthy, that women are emotional and weak, and that women don't have the same level of God-given power and therefore shouldn't have a voice. There's great danger in seeing women having less power and less value because of this idea. For a wolf, he will exploit that power, and then a woman has little voice and power to speak up against that. So what happens? Just in just a few minutes, we're going to hear a little bit more about the impact of trauma, but I'll just say a few things. The victim will have a long, slow, painful journey of impact. There's physical impact on the brain, health problems, like symptoms of trauma. There's financial impact, relational impact, emotional impact. Diane Langberg, in her book, Counseling Survivors of Sexual Abuse, talks about our God-given image. We've been given a voice. We've been given power and relationship. Those things are shattered with abuse, where power was misused against someone, and they believe I'm powerless. They have no voice. They've been silenced. And again, the greatest tool of the abuser is trust and relationship, and their idea of safety and trust are shattered. The most egregious impact is spiritual. They will permanently have, in situations of clergy sexual abuse, they will permanently have impact of the idea of spiritual leader and most likely God and his truth, which will have been grossly misrepresented and are now twisted up with the evil abuse. We talked about that deep sense of betrayal and how that impacts them. 50% of those surveyed in Fuller's study said that their experience with the church after the abuse was negatively impacted. That makes sense. And 80% agree or strongly agree that their experience with the church after the abuse negatively affected their spiritual life. And again, that makes sense. I want to read something to you by Krista Brown in her book, This Little Light. And I share this with you because I want you to think about any abuse survivors and how it may impact them spiritually, how it may be a barrier for them participating in Christian community, hearing the scriptures. And that might not be them being sinful, that might be them being traumatized. She says this, God loves you. Lots of people seem to want to tell me that, and I hate it when they do. It's a visceral response. Those words ring in my ears like a vile curse. I'd rather hear someone say, go to hell than God loves you. Perhaps God does indeed love me, but I will never sense it in the sound of those words. For me, those words feel like words of hate. People seem to also want to tell me that God will heal me if only I will put my faith in him. I try to be polite because they're usually well-intentioned, but to me, those are all hurtful words. Faith is what got me into this. Faith is where the path turned terribly wrong. For most people of faith, their faith is a source of solace. It gives them comfort and strength for all manners of life travails. It's a powerful resource for healing, but for me, faith is neurologically networked with a nightmare. Sexual trauma and faith are inextricably seared together into the brain. This is what it means to be subjected to the force of faith unleashed by a clergy predator. It's not only physically, psychologically, and emotionally devastating, but it's also spiritually annihilating. It's soul murder. It's why many experts talk about the unique nature of clergy abuse trauma and the devastation of its impact. When faith has been used as a weapon, it becomes almost impossible to use it as a resource for healing. You can't pick which edge of the faith blade you use. It's the same bloody sword. So in spite of the really heavy, long, slow impact, it's amazing to see how many women are resilient. One of the things that I've done research on is post-traumatic growth, which is this idea that survivors most often, when having the right resources for healing, can not only bounce back, which is the idea of resiliency, but can grow forward from where they were at the point of trauma in 5 areas: relationships, finding their personal strength, realizing they're stronger than they ever thought they were, faith in God, new beginnings, and their perception of life. I've seen that time and time again with survivors. If you've had the privilege of interacting with survivors, you know what I'm talking about. They're our greatest teachers and sources of inspiration because of the post-traumatic growth that can be so evident in them. So we're going to hear more about how we can respond institutionally, and I encourage you to listen, because it takes all of us to just believe survivors, listening to them, providing support for them to speak to the truth, and follow them, walk with them to whatever extent they want to go in reporting, using the highest extent possible of the law and legal authorities. Expect it's a long, slow, repetitious journey, and the commitment to supporting survivors and abuse reform is long, slow, costly, but necessary, valuable work. Last year, there was a presentation on trauma-informed care, and I believe that recording is still available. In fact, maybe Todd can tell us how you can get the link, because it talks about how the church can be the reversal of the trauma experience, that voice, power, and relationship. What if our church communities were safe places where voices were restored, where choices are offered, where safety is found again in the context of trusted relationships? But know that you entering in and bearing witness is important. Know that they've lost a lot, but being somebody who can actually represent Christ in an accurate way is extremely healing. And I would just say a couple more things, and I think Chellee can say all this better than I can. Don't just sequester them to a trauma-informed counselor in the community. That's important. Connect them with those. But ask how you can minister them just as a church family. Don't sequester them to like this abuse support group we have, once a week, every Wednesday. So we're good. We're trauma-informed. We have that. Now, how do we become safe places for them to integrate and for them to be themselves wherever they're at in their journey? Pastors, speak to the survivors in your congregation. Just listen. They have great ideas. They've got amazing insight and wisdom. And talk about things like abuse and trauma in your sermons. That goes a long way. I'd like to close by once again quoting Diane Langberg. And this is my challenge to you. Our head puts before us a choice: the preservation of our systems, our families, churches, organizations, and cultures, or love and obedience to Jesus Christ, no matter the cost. Ask yourself, will I be complicit with the sin of abuse, and in so doing align myself with the abuser and with darkness in order to preserve my world? Will I say I do so for the sake of the mission, the church, and God's work? Or will I ever and always be faithful to the name and character of the head I follow? Though the earth shake and the mountains fall into the sea, may we, who are already in positions of power and influence, lead the way by falling on our faces, imploring God to make us like himself, no matter the cost, to our positions, our programs, our organizations, our ministries, or our traditions. Thank you so much.
I want to give as much time as possible to our other two speakers, and so I'm going to keep my remarks short, but I did want to take a moment to build on what Dr. Evans has shared with us. Speak directly, especially to pastors and ministry leaders in the room, about how we understand and talk about abuse. What we understand about abuse is vitally important to both preventing abuse and to caring well for survivors when abuse occurs. What we say about abusive behavior has great significance in adequately addressing the issue. If you are watching the news at all, or you're on Twitter or on any kind of media, you're seeing over and over, week after week, reports of abuse occurring in our churches, and stories of adult abuse abound. I've noticed a pattern in the way that churches and church leaders talk about abuse, and there seems to be a strong preference to use minimizing language, and I believe that's a grave mistake. We often see minimizing language from perpetrators themselves and from those who wish to restore abusers to positions of leadership. Just looking at some of the key cases in SBC life, I noticed some of the phrases that are used. The use of less inflammatory words than abuse, like sexual misconduct or inappropriate behavior or morally inappropriate, or they committed a sexual sin. Often when seeking to restore someone to ministry, emphasizing their repentance, that they've been forgiven, that God forgives sin, and that was over a decade ago, or a person should not be judged for their worst moments. I'm quoting some of the articles here and what has been said, or in a prominent case, it's not abuse because it falls short of a legal accusation. So I just want to take the next few moments to address this problem of language and understanding. When abuse occurs, we should rightly call it abuse. Dr. Evans has given a good description of predatory behavior and some of the dynamics related to sexual abuse. She could have gone on another hour and give us great detail. I want to speak pastorally and share 3 reasons why, as pastors and church leaders, we should use the term abuse to describe this behavior. 3 reasons that I use the term abuse. One is that the word abuse is an apt description of the behavior we're talking about and its gravity. We learn that it's an abuse of power, it's abuse of position. A person uses their power, their position, their authority to not serve others, but to satisfy his own desires. A pastor or person in ministry, we have a fiduciary duty to act not in our own interest, but act in the interest of the persons that we serve. The Bible addresses this explicitly and talks about the abuse of power by spiritual leaders. Romans 16:18 speaks of those who do not serve the Lord Christ, but serve their own appetites. In 1 Samuel 2, it describes the abuse of power that Eli's sons Hophni and Phinehas exercised as they coerced temple worshipers for their own personal gain. And we find in verse 22 that among their abuses was sleeping with the women working in the tent of meeting. What you see in 2 Timothy 3, 6 and 7 is an example of what Dr. Evans called grooming. Exploiting the vulnerable, using their spiritual authority and knowledge to exploit, manipulate, control. The Greek is literally taking captive women who are vulnerable. Walter Liefeld from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, in his commentary on 2 Timothy writes this. So there have been many societies and many ages of history where women were abused in one way or another. And while the specifics of the first century are a thing of the past, it's possible for pastors, daycare employees, youth leaders, and others in contemporary churches to play on the weaknesses of people who depend on them for religious guidance. Unscrupulous clergy can exploit people both sexually and rather than care for the very persons whose need leads them to church for help. So it's an abuse of power, abuse of authority. It's also an abuse of the person. We call it abuse because you're abusing an individual. You're abusing a person, using another, not caring for that person, but exploiting that person for yourself, causing great harm to the person as well as their loved ones and the church community. Matthew 7:5, Jesus says, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. In Ezekiel 34, the prophet says, as I live, declares the Lord God, surely because my sheep have become a prey, and my sheep have become food for all the wild beasts, since there was no shepherd, and because my shepherds have not searched for my sheep, but they have fed themselves on the sheep. When shepherds devour sheep, when sheep are truly wolves, it's right that we call it abuse. Secondly, the word abuse rightly frames and helps us to frame what true repentance looks like and why disqualification from ministry is an appropriate long-term consequence for the behavior. True repentance will not merely acknowledge sexual infidelity, but also the abuse of power and the sins that accompany it. The exploitation, the control, the power, the manipulation, all of those things need to be repented of. You did not only commit a sexual sin. You sinned in abusing your power and your position to exploit someone else for your own personal sexual gratification. We rightly call it abuse, and it points us to what true repentance will look like. It's quite common to hear churches defend leaders, whether they be pastors or deacons or worship leaders, that have an abusive past, using the themes of forgiveness and grace and restoration. I believe the gospel. God forgives, God restores, God gives grace. But in nearly all of these cases where we're trying to restore a pastor, we're using terms of sexual impropriety and not sexual abuse. And rightly calling this sin abuse helps us to recognize that those sexual abuse is a sin that God can forgive, that God does forgive. A minister or leader should never again be placed in a position of leadership where they can abuse again. And if we're not using the term abuse, we're not calling people to true repentance. One of the consequences of the sin of abuse, even when there's grace and forgiveness, is that the person is disqualified from holding a place of authority and leadership and power again. A fact that we recognized in Anaheim last year in a resolution on this very subject. So we need to be using the right terminology when we're talking about abuse. Thirdly, the word abuse helps us to focus on care for the victim. When we use minimizing language to describe adult abuse, we not only misname the sin, but we fail to recognize that there is someone who's been sinned against. Where there's sexual offender, there's a victim of that offense. And too often, actually in the overwhelming majority of cases of adult abuse, and particularly adult clergy abuse, the survivor has little to no support, and the church, as we've heard, brings further harm on the individual, and she often loses her church. Pamela Cooper White notes that many victimized women report that not only have they lost their church community, but their trust has been so violated they cannot go to any church. I believe we fail when we mislabel abuse and the predatory behavior that constitutes abuse merely as sexual sin. We're minimizing the actions of the pastor or leader. We're failing to care for the victim, and we're failing to respond to the abuse with the consequence it deserves. When we go even a step further and call it an affair, we're adding an additional layer of harm because we're joining the abuser in shifting blame and heaping shame on that person, taking the victim, making them a co-conspirator in the act, or more often, as we learn about Darvo, reversing the victim and the offender altogether. So the repentant leader becomes the hero while the victim of the abuse is shamed and shunned by the church. This should never be so. Final thought I want to share is the argument that sexual misconduct is not abuse because it falls, and again, I'm quoting one of the articles about one of our lawsuits. It's not sexual abuse because it falls short of legal accusation. Why this legal argument is insufficient. Now, whether or not an action is criminal is not a reliable indicator of whether or not the action is abusive. Laws, for one, are often insufficient. You can see our resolution passed in Anaheim, where we called on lawmakers to pass laws that would provide consistent definitions and classification of sexual abuse by pastors. We call on encouraging lawmakers to pass laws that would empower churches by shielding them from civil liability when they share information. We ask to ensure churches are not places for predators to hide, so that we have a culture of transparency and mutual responsibility between churches. This is what we agreed on last year. One of the reasons that we needed that resolution because there's a hesitance of the legal system to interfere in church issues, even when the law is in place, even when criminal behavior occurs. While laws that govern other adult relationships like teacher-student, doctor-patient, those have been passed and those are being enforced. Legislators have been reluctant to pass laws that address abuse by clergy and church leaders because they have a misguided notion of the separation of church and state. Even when those laws exist, Tobin and Helge in their study in a paper called Sexual Misconduct of Clergy Persons demonstrate the reluctance of courts have had to apply the standards of fiduciary care and misconduct in churches because of, quote, entanglement in religion. Courts don't want to get involved. Judges don't want to get involved. Legislators don't want to get involved. Even when there's laws and evidence, prosecutors don't want to take cases. So relying on the standard of we reported it to the police, but there was no criminal behavior, does not mean that abuse has not occurred, and it's not a sufficient standard for us to hold abusers accountable. Likewise, prosecutors are reluctant to bring these cases because of the perceived difficulty in trying the case, even when all the evidence is in front of them. And we're seeing that in case after case in the SBC as well as other places. Any claim that abuse did not occur because it has not been proven in court fails to recognize that the legal system is broken in regard to sexual abuse generally, and in regard to adult clergy sexual abuse particularly. Thirdly, as pastors and shepherds, we have a higher standard than the legal system.
That's right.
As shepherds, we have a duty to protect the sheep from the wolves, and not only doctrinal wolves who would lead congregants away from the truth of the gospel, but also the kind of wolves in sheep clothing who we see in Ezekiel 34, where sheep are prey and they feed themselves rather than the sheep. So as we continue to address sexual abuse in our denomination, our churches, let us do so as faithful shepherds of God's flock. A lot more than I want to say, but I want to give time for our last speaker, Chellee, before we bring Chellee and her husband Peter up to interview them. Chellee's going to talk about what we can do as churches to better respond to abuse, and I'm going to invite you to come.
Hello. Oh, am I not close enough? Author Mary Demuth says, an untold story never heals. And as I thought on this, it occurred to me that it's stories that change hearts, not statistics. So, let me tell you a story. I was still numb from that morning's events. My campus pastor, who was also my boss and my counselor, had taken what he wanted. I had been confused for weeks, but the fog seemed heavier as I tried to explain in intimate detail what had led to that morning to the 4 men sitting in my lead pastor's office. My timeline was a mess. I kept going back and forth. I explained how I constantly said no, how I cried while being backed up against the wall, and how I told him that I couldn't breathe. All while also trying to take ownership. I wasn't strong enough. I let this happen. It had to be my fault. My pastor said we were in this together. He said I was a tease and that I had the control. Even while relaying the horrible things he said to me, I tried to protect him. The pastors heard what I had to say, told me not to speak to anyone who was affiliated with the church, and then sent my husband and I away. The next day, via phone, they demanded my resignation and again my silence, saying it was for my protection. And they also told me that I wasn't welcome on any campus or event for 6 weeks. A church-wide email was sent out praising my abuser, whom had been allowed to resign. They talked of his great works for God's kingdom, his love of Christ, and how deeply he would be missed as he was now moving on. I was lost. My entire life was wrapped up in that church, and I wasn't allowed to speak to anyone. I lost 20% of my body weight, half of my hair, and all ability to function as a wife or mother. In time, I was made aware that what had occurred was actually abuse. Asking for another meeting, Peter and I specifically asked that the lead pastor be present, but he refused, stating it was too difficult for him emotionally and he had more important things to do. In that meeting, I explained predators and grooming and was met with defense and further accusations. The following day, the lead pastor called when I told him I was going to the police. He spent 40 minutes telling me why it was not my responsibility to call out another man's sin, and I needed to deal with the plank in my own eye. While I was filing the police report, the church was hiring an employment lawyer. Only they told me she was an investigator so that I would cooperate, which I did. Florida law does not protect adults against psychological abuse or manipulation, nor does it protect victims whose trauma response is to appease or fawn instead of fight. Still, my detective went to the church to tell leadership how this man had targeted and abused me, but they didn't care, saying no laws were broken. Because I had been silenced, my abuser and leadership were able to create a narrative that best worked for them while turning me into the enemy. I was hated, vilified, rejected, even threatened. I prayed for death daily, and each morning started with tears when I realized God still hadn't let me die. I was afraid to leave my house in fear of whom I would run into. The rumors I had heard about myself made me physically ill, and I cried nonstop for months. Desperate, Peter and I finally shared a tiny bit with friends from the church, and immediately leadership called a meeting. I didn't want to go, but I thought, maybe this will be when they get it right. Maybe this will be when they choose light over darkness. Instead, they patronized me, by telling me how wrong my abuser was for taking advantage of me and using his power to do it. Immediately followed by telling us that we hurt people when we told them what happened and we were living in sin by gossiping. They again demanded my silence, but this time told me that if I couldn't commit, we were no longer welcome to participate in their fellowship. They said a lot of words, but all I heard was, "We don't want you." They also demanded a letter from my trauma counselor stating that I was healed enough to be in an environment where I wouldn't be triggered into talking about the abuse. Healed enough. This was not even 4 months post-abuse, and they wanted me to be healed enough. And guys, let me tell you, it has now been 28 months since the abuse, and I have made amazing progress in my healing, but I will never be healed enough until I find myself in the arms of Jesus. I have never felt so discarded, so worthless, or so insignificant. If the church that represents God didn't want me, why would I think God felt any different? My faith shattered. The only thing that had been constant my entire life was broken. God no longer loved me. I was not the lost sheep that the shepherd went after. I was the damaged sheep that was cast out because my bleeding wounds were staining their carpet and I wasn't worth the cleanup. So now you know how not to respond. I have 4 steps to offer you to help safeguard and respond better. First, create a safe church. Provide an environment that welcomes concerns and abuse to be reported. All pastors and staff should be trauma-informed. The more aware and informed your leaders are, the less likely that red flags will go excused or unnoticed. Invite survivors to have a voice. Give them space to share with your staff or to give their perspectives in sermon prep meetings. They are experts in their experience and they can tell you exactly what makes them feel safe or rejected. Then, educate your congregation. I guarantee when you start implementing trauma-informed speech into your sermons, you will have congregants come to tell you their own stories of abuse. For some, it will be the first time they ever tell anyone. Imagine the honor of being able to lift someone's deepest wounds because you created a safe space to do so. Second, respond well upon disclosure. My friend, Dr. David Pooler, says that when abuse happens in the church, they have the decision to either respond in courage or in fear. The more you respond with courage, the less a victim is further harmed. The more you respond with betrayal or fear, the harder for a victim to trust in the future and the more likely that they will be to walk away from their faith. Survivors consistently claim institutional response adds far greater trauma than the initial sexual abuse ever did. Consider the violation of our physical bodies is but a small fraction compared to the violation of our hearts, our faith, and our sense of belonging. Use the proper label. Adult clergy sexual abuse. It is not a moral failing. It is not an affair. It is not adultery. It is abuse. If my leaders had labeled the abuse upon my disclosure, I still would have tried to protect him. But the wall of confusion would have been breached, allowing clarity to begin to seep in, and my healing would have started immediately instead of several months later, compounded by even further trauma from the church. I know survivors who are decades out of their abuse, who are only now coming to realize what had occurred. Imagine the pain and hurt I described before that covered just 4 months of that season, being drawn out for decades. The dejection, the anguish, the shame, all could have been relieved if these victims' institutions had had enough courage to love them like Christ. Institutional response is entirely up to leadership. If leadership doesn't support the survivor from the beginning, the entire church will support the abuser. Congregants will always defer to the pastor in conflicts of interest. They will never go to the victim unless they see leadership leading the way to them. If upon a victim's disclosure, your first thoughts are for your reputation, your bottom line, or your church's image, you should not be a pastor. Rather, when confronted with abuse, your first concern should be for the victim. This heinous sin committed against one of God's children should cause your hearts to grieve so deeply that your suffering and anguish resembles the same suffering of the one standing before you. Third, believe the victim. Hire an outside organization that specializes in abuse to do an investigation. Look for a system that is survivor-centric, trauma-informed, and has experts on staff. If you choose to also involve lawyers, be transparent with the victim and encourage her to, at the very least, have an advocate with her to all meetings. Pay for her counseling without limitations. Let her choose the counselor. Let her deem how long or how frequently she needs to go and continue paying until she thinks she's ready to move on. Finally, hold the offender accountable. Fire them. Revoke their ordination, expose them publicly so that they do not harm anyone else. And for the love of God, do not praise them as they exit your sanctuary. I pray you never have to experience any of this, but should you find yourself here, be transparent with your church. Go after the one, prioritize the marginalized, be patient with survivors, do not expect anything from them. Above all, demonstrate Jesus to your congregation, and remember, an untold story never heals. Thank you.
So I'm going to just go unconventional here. I'm going to start with you, Peter. Did your wife have an affair?
Oh my goodness. No. 1,000 times no. Even when she initially came home to disclose to me, it didn't make any sense because it didn't make any sense. And I'd love to give you like all of the details about all of the grooming and the months of behavior from her abuser and the really ridiculous conversations, but it was the power dynamic. Like there was no, she couldn't say no. There was no consent. It just wasn't, it was never on the table. And even though our situation is full of circumstances that make the power dynamics much, much bigger, the reality is even the stories from survivors of clergy sexual abuse where it seems like they could have said no, or it seems like they said yes. The power dynamic alone, the vulnerability alone, the position that those men have of spiritual trust makes it abuse every time.
Just kind of an open-ended question. How has the experience of adult clergy sexual abuse affected you individually, as a couple? Whatever you want to say about that. Just want to give you a chance to maybe talk about the impact it's had on you.
Well, I touched a little bit on that in what I said earlier. My physical health suffered. I was completely incapable of functioning or trusting myself to make any decisions. I pretty much just followed Peter around because I didn't trust myself. It would take me an hour to get dressed every day because I would change my clothes repeatedly because this could send a message. Somebody might say something about this. This is too tight. This is, this covers too much. I'm being too modest. Like everything was questioned. Every single decision my children, our children, thankfully were old enough that they were independent enough to be able to take care of themselves. But I was definitely not a mother in that sense. Not definitely not a wife. I was just a mess of tears for many months.
For me, I had to pick up a lot of slack just because she couldn't function. It took months. It sounds crazy, but it took months before I realized that I had also experienced trauma because I just couldn't, there wasn't space to go there. I had to make sure that the kids could still eat. I had to make sure that my wife would get up and eat. We had a lot of personal stuff that extended her vulnerability going into the abuse that still had to be dealt with. I ran my own business and I had to smile for my customers and make sure I could get work done so I could get the mortgage paid. And because I didn't have, our whole life was in the church, our community, everybody. I served on the worship team for 14 years that we were at that church with her abuser and a lot of other people that I thought would have come to our aid. We had one family once that took us out to dinner. Once. I'm still broken. I'm still not okay. I have friends. I have good friends now. People that look out for us and people that watch out for us. But I'm a shell of what I was.
I want to give you permission, even though I gave you the questions ahead of time, I want to give you permission to not answer if at any point you don't want to answer this. How has this affected you? Well, you spiritually. Let's go there.
It's been 28 months, and I still can't read my Bible. I struggle to pray, and I used to pray constantly. We go to church, and we sit, and we listen, and we read. And the fact that we can go to church is a huge testament. Most survivors don't. We've had to deconstruct a lot of what we were taught because some man said it from stage, so it must be true. But then when we needed them, none of their words turned into action. And yeah, my relationship with God is different than it was. It's not worse, except that it's better, but it's different. And I find a lot of peace just in knowing that during my abuse, and even now when I struggle, He is grieving with me in it. And that's enough for me right now.
When all this started, when the abuse was disclosed and the church told us that we couldn't be there. So I worked for myself. I could kind of do what I wanted at work. And so I listened to the same 28 or 30 worship songs over and over again for weeks while the church's employment lawyer was conducting her investigation. Songs that I had played on stage with dear friends and people that I really loved while the church was formulating their reasons why they weren't liable. I think I played one weekend, maybe two, after the abuse. And I haven't played guitar in 2 years. I can't listen to worship music. I go on Sunday and I stand. And that's it. I did. You know, the sad thing is, it's all the way that the church handled it. It's not the abuse. It's not the abuser. It's not the one guy. It's not the guy that everybody wants to say, this is the guy that did all wrong, and the church did their best, and they tried to handle their best. It's the church. It was the church's response. It was the way that they discarded us, and the way that they showed us very clearly how little they thought of us, that cemented in my head every time I'm around something spiritual that was a huge part of my life for those 14 years. Every time that I'm in those situations, those environments, that's what I'm worried about, is the betrayal.
So I know there's been some pockets of support for you that have been positive, and want to give you the opportunity to share where have you found support if it wasn't from your church, where have you been supported?
The most support came from friends that I've known since third grade that were not affiliated with the church. In fact, one of them was the one who told me that it was abuse. She's a pediatrician and a mandatory reporter. And when I told her what happened in my little confession, I finished and she said, Chellee, that's not what happened. This man is a predator and he groomed you. And so though we locally, we didn't have any support at all. There was no one. So I had my best of friends that I've known pretty much my whole life. And they rallied around me and supported me and loved me. And the sad thing is my very best friend supported me the most, and she's an atheist. And eventually we started going to another church. Well, I shouldn't say eventually. We went to another church straight away, but we didn't talk to anyone. We still didn't talk to anyone. But a new leader, lead pastor was hired, and I was over it. I didn't want to go to church anymore. I was done. So I said to Peter, we need to sit with this new pastor and see where he stands on trauma and abuse. And I fully expected him to respond poorly, and that would be my excuse to never go to church anymore, because I would have tried, right? And I'd have a reason to leave, and he didn't do that. He said he wasn't trauma informed, and then proceeded to tell me all of the people that only people who at least are attempting to be trauma informed follow. And since then, and he's here in this room right now, but since then, we've met with him every single month to discuss trauma and abuse, and that has really helped our cynicism fade and allow me to begin to trust not just men, but pastors again, slowly and cautiously. And that has been instrumental in my healing. I did take the church to court, and my attorney, Boss Trigagen, has also been instrumental in my healing, just reclaiming my agency in that matter, but also being connected to my support system, my support group, Restored Voices Collective, and only talking with adult clergy, sexual abuse survivors, people who understand better than anyone, has really helped my healing.
Sorry. Yeah, there was almost no support from anybody at church. We did have one pastor. He was a worship pastor at one of the campuses that early on made himself available. You know, the men on the executive team, the men that were handling our issue, they never made themselves available personally to be with us and just sit in our pain. But this one worship pastor who I had served with on the worship team, he came over to our house and he sat and he listened for 6 hours. And Chellee told him every detail of everything that had happened. And at the end, he just apologized on behalf of the church. Like he should, like any pastor should have. He right away said, yeah, any pastor who tries to have any sort of sexual relationship with a congregant is absolutely a predator. And as an employee of the church, there wasn't a whole lot that he could do and keep his job. And we knew that. We never faulted him for it. But in the little ways that he could, he supported us. A couple of other people, but for the most part, our support has come from outside of that church. That's the big thing that happens when it's inside the church. They don't understand.
All right, so I'll ask one last question. Is there anything either of you would like to say to the people in this room, whether it be pastors, survivors, whoever, or anyone that's going to be watching this later, that didn't come up in a previous question or anything else? Anything that you'd like to say to this audience? Either one of you.
It's never too late to do what is right.
If you just help me show encouragement, appreciation for these two.